Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Wounds into Wisdom, Healing Intergenerational Jewish Trauma by Rabbi Tirzah Firestone, Ph.D., forward by Gabor Mate, M.D., narrated by Rabbi Tirzah Firestone, Ph.D. Publisher's Note: this audiobook includes bonus material. Please visit tantor.com and type Wounds into Wisdom into the search box. Follow the link to the books page, then, under the supplemental content section, please enter the access code Paradox, and then click the Unlock button to access the bonus material. The code should be entered in all lowercase letters. The reading and discussion guide for this audiobook can be found in the bonus material. In memory of my brother Daniel and my sister Shulamith.
Forward, narrated by Barry Abrams. In Wounds into Wisdom, Rabbi Tirzah Firestone melds her skills as a psychotherapist with the spiritual insights of the rabbinic tradition she is steeped in. The result is a work characterized by wisdom, insight, and compassion, all brought to bear on what is surely one of the most painful subjects in modern history, Jewish trauma and its intergenerational reverberations. The book is a courageous undertaking in two senses. First, the author is unsparingly forthcoming in depicting how the catastrophic sufferings of the Jewish people in the 20th century impacted her own family, the traumatic imprints of her survivor parents having been passed on to their offspring with dire results. The supreme irony was that her parents' rigid clinging to tradition with the intent of preserving what the Nazis had tried to annihilate caused the dissolution of the family and the tragic demise of two of Tirzah's gifted siblings. It is a tribute to Tirzah's commitment to healing and to the religious teachings she had abandoned and then re-embraced that she was able to find in her grievous losses what she describes as a terrible gift. Indeed, that is part of her core message, that in the deepest suffering we may find the seeds of transformation. The young Tirzah resented and rebelled against the biblical teaching that God remembers the sins of the fathers upon their children even unto the third and fourth generations. What kind of God was that, I wondered, who couldn't lay down his grudges, even to the point that innocent children would be caught up in their grandparents' mistakes, and then to boast about it? The mature rabbi and therapist sees deeper. God here does not refer to a sadistic, punitive deity, but the most profound reality. The Bible is conveying a universal truth. The violations and heartbreaks suffered in one era often continue to travel through time, creating a legacy of new suffering until they are finally faced and felt. Feeling and facing, learning from, and transforming the bitter actuality of Jewish trauma is Tirzah's central intention, and ultimately, the wisdom she seeks to bestow upon her readers. She guides us, too, to find the gifts in terrible events, as she has had to, in order to break the chain of trauma transmission midor ledor, as the Hebrew has it, from generation to generation. The second point of bravery in this book is its stalwart refusal to cast Jews purely in the role of victims. This is not an act of denial, but an affirmation of the Jewish spirit, a special expression of the indomitable spirit of humanity. There is no questioning nor obscuring of facts or history. The Nazi genocide as an act of mechanized mass murder in the service of psychotic hatred is unique in the annals of human experience, dripping with the blood of innocents, as those annals are. Tirzah notes with compassion the impacts of the horrors without relegating its subjects and their descendants to passive role of victims. In this refusal, she nowhere implies that we Jews were somehow responsible for what befell us, but she strongly advocates for our power in responding to the historical calamities of the centuries. That power, humanely deployed, divests us of victimhood. A refreshing aspect of this book is its bracing examination of the concept of Jewish chosenness. Despite the historical tragedies, Tirzah rejects this special category, both in its senses of a people having been selected for unique and unrelenting suffering at the hands of others, that is, of a suspicious and fearful worldview, and in its sense of some vague or overt moral or religious precedents. The latter is a semi-conscious habit which many Jews, if we are honest with ourselves, will acknowledge as a rarely articulated but often present undertone in Jewish self-discourse. She sees both as constrictive and as a subversion of the deep impulse to be, to the extent of our abilities, faithful to the spiritual calling our own prophetic tradition has venerated. In that vein, it is up to us, as to all peoples, to live up to the best expectations and highest qualities one's culture has taught and embodied. This has everything to do with genuine pride, but has nothing in common with chauvinism. It occurred to me, Tirzah reports, how dangerously fine the line was between chosenness and racial supremacy. Taken as religious mandate, an identity of chosenness implies a racial bias. It sanctions seeing oneself as superior. It denies the equality and dignity of other peoples, races, and voices. For some, the most controversial aspect of Rabbi Firestone's discussion of Jewish trauma and healing may be her examination of the Israel/Palestine conflict, which by any objective measure has seen the realization of a Jewish dream of liberation leading to the dispossession and suffering of another people. Tirzah here approaches the conflict not as a judge of either side, nor as an advocate for either, but as a healer. Compassionately, she hears both sides and gives voices to the grief and suffering and yearning for peace of both. Beyond promising the possibilities of healing, the book ends with an extended section on its practicalities. Tirzah outlines 7 principles, steps if you will, that, if followed, can lead to the restoration of wholeness both on the individual level and in the life of a people whose communal fabric has been frayed by multi-generational trauma. In this, she relies on both modern psychological insights and on the legacy of tradition. One core strength of that tradition, paradoxically enough, is its capacity for renewal and change. In other words, in its refreshing willingness to challenge tradition itself. I discovered, Tirzah writes, that the Jewish path contains much life-giving medicine, nor is it monolithic, but full of divergent voices, interpretations, and room for innovation. I understood that Judaism had survived not only by dint of its adherence to law and custom, but because of its ability to evolve and adapt to whatever conditions Jews were subjected, however challenging. Both as an infant survivor of genocide and as a physician and author much concerned with the healing of trauma, both personal and collective, I was struck by how aptly Tirzah's hard-earned lessons could be applied to people hurting within, but also well beyond the Jewish community. Wounds into Wisdom is a vivid demonstration that, while we may not be able to choose our past, we are certainly able to choose our attitude toward the present and future. Indeed, it is both our privilege and task to do so, for our own sake and that of future generations. Gabor Mate, M.D., author of The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture.
Preface. The world has changed immeasurably since Wounds into Wisdom was first released in 2019. It would not be an exaggeration to say that being alive today is to be confronted with the effects of trauma in all directions. Whether we are talking about high-stakes wars, social isolation, gun violence, or the floods and fires of a warming planet, the tolls of trauma are everywhere. I began my research for Wounds into Wisdom with the people closest to me, my own Jewish family, and community. The science of trauma helped me to understand where I had come from and the historical factors that underlie the problematic behaviors within and around me. Later, as a rabbi and psychotherapist, the knowledge of how trauma's residues can be transmitted intergenerationally allowed me to put into context the conundrums that so many families and individuals I worked with were experiencing. Anxiety, shame, addiction, emotional reactivity, and numbness, to name just a few examples. Embarking on writing this book brought healing to me and my own family, and it has become a talisman in tender times. It was when I embarked on teaching the research and principles from this book more broadly that I realized that the topic of healing intergenerational trauma has far vaster implications than I initially imagined. I quickly learned that the 7 principles applied to every ethnicity and nationality I encountered. Just like our ancestors' unresolved life experiences reverberate within us and shape us, so the collective misdeeds of past generations affect entire populations when they are not reconciled. I'm thinking here about the massive traumas resulting from the collective suffering caused by the indigenous genocide in North America, the abduction and enslavement of millions of Africans by white-skinned Europeans, and the centuries of cruel domination of girls and women by societies around the world. Far from finished, these traumas are carried in our cellular memory as individuals and as entire populations. They now demand our attention and reckoning. I've been deeply honored to teach and learn from people around the world. For example, when I was invited to address the prisoners of San Quentin, I was surprised by their deep understanding of trauma's transmission. They broke my heart open with stories about their fathers' failed efforts to love them, their mothers' and grandmothers' wisdom and tender care. I also experienced nobility in the face of great suffering from Indigenous elders in Canada, who brought sacred ceremony to the burial grounds where their children's bones had been freshly exhumed after being brutally murdered and buried by proponents of state-sponsored schools. I learned to listen with compassion to the descendants of Nazi officers who struggled with the onus of their ancestors' crimes, and I cried with those who had suffered atrocities at the hands of Eastern European fascist regimes. All of them, people like you and me, were grappling with the unfinished business of their ancestors' lives. So while the research and case studies in this book involve Jewish trauma survivors and bear the particular hallmarks of my people's persecution, the teachings and principles derived from them apply to all people. Whether our forebears survived Jewish discrimination or any other kind of discrimination, whether they were the victims or perpetrators, colonized or colonizers, all our wounds must be healed for us to break the chains of suffering for the generations that follow us. Because whatever our background or ethnicity, life's injuries mysteriously find their way into the future to seek resolution. That is why many of us feel the echoes of our ancestors' lives vibrating in us today. The traumas they endured, the injustices they witnessed, the quandaries they never solved, are looking to us for completion. Since writing Wounds into Wisdom, I have had the immense honor of teaching side by side with extraordinary teachers representing many points of view, including Gloria Steinem, Resmaa Menakem, Sharon Salzberg, Mirabai Starr, Freedom Cartwright, Anita Sanchez, and Gabor Mate. Listening to their voices and the experiences of hundreds of students around the world, I have learned that all trauma is intergenerational. And while our individual wounds are rooted in our people's particular stories and flavors, we all have an opportunity now to make a quantum leap in awareness. Because much that has gone unhealed in the past is coming due in our day. And much of the accrued wisdom of history is available to us now. We are the ones to help heal the past because it lives in the present. It lives in us. I welcome you into this book on the journey of transforming your wounds into wisdom. You belong to a family of millions of people around the globe who have embarked upon the path of intergenerational healing. How will your life change? How will the world change in turn? The answer lies within us. Life itself will tell the story. Part 1. Introduction. Shedding new light on a dark history. In my 25th year, I dreamed of a slender Hungarian woman dressed in a fur coat. Beneath her lavish attire, I saw that she was, in fact, a naked skeleton, peering at me with both irony and affection. The woman could see that I was young and raw, paralyzed by an unnamed guilt, barely able to buy myself a teapot or a second-hand sweater without being assailed by self-doubt. "Darling," she called to me, her thick accent comforting and somehow familiar. "Don't be a fool. Don't you think we would be enjoying our beautiful things if we could?" Her jaw clacked with bony laughter. Suddenly, the lights went on and the room filled with richly clad Hungarian ladies, skeletons all, enjoying a tea party. It was clear that they were all dead, yet they were also radiant and full of life. Turning toward me, their voices rose in unison. "Do you think it helps us that you suffer? Live the life we could not live." I sat up in bed and wept. Their words had penetrated me, touching the core of my malaise. An outsized case of survivor's guilt I did not know I had. Live the life we could not live. These words became a turning point, a mantra, a North Star. I took them with me as I found my footing in the world, followed the call to become a psychotherapist, and ultimately rejoined the religion that I had fled. But it was not until 15 years later that I learned the truth of my dream. I learned that my German grandmother's entire family came from Austro-Hungary. Almost all had been murdered in Nazi Europe. Their elegant bearing had not helped them one whit to escape Hitler's roundups. Their assimilation into high society meant nothing in the end. Stripped of all their beautiful things, they died like paupers in the death camps. Like many post-Holocaust families, my parents did not speak directly of these matters. The heavy legacy of loss remained muted. Yet, for my 5 siblings and me, it was like finding ourselves in deep waters without life vest or instruction. We responded as best we could, each of us fighting the undertow of history, swimming or sinking, not knowing how to help one another, divided by the trauma we had inherited, but never knowing why. Scholars of intergenerational trauma tell us that the silence shrouding a family's untold stories paradoxically becomes the strongest form of transmission. This was the case in my own family and in myriad families with whom I have worked as a rabbi and psychotherapist. Yet there is an inner compulsion to know. One has to know one's buried truth in order to be able to live one's life, writes the late Professor Dori Laub, himself a survivor. Many of us struggle to bring to consciousness the hidden legacies that our families bequeath to us. For some, it takes years to piece together the unspoken wounds that have shaped our lives. The residue of our ancestors' unresolved injury does not simply disappear. In fact, it often weighs most heavily on the introspective, sensitive members of the next generations. Beginning with the stories of my own family and the post-Holocaust community that shaped my young life, this book combines insights from recent scientific research with the voices of Jewish survivors and their descendants from around the world. Among others, we will hear from Avi, who was sent out into the streets of Krakow as a 4-year-old and lived to become an Israeli military hero. Esti, whose entire family was haunted by a tragic secret left behind in Iran. Rami, who lost his daughter in a suicide bombing and joined forces with a bereaved Palestinian to grieve and speak out. And from many others, from college students to octogenarians. The search that became this book began inside a progressive American Jewish community, where for 2 decades I led a flourishing congregation and came into contact with people at every stage of living and dying. There I watched, studied, and counseled Jewish families as they resurrected life in the 2nd, 3rd, and now 4th generations after the Holocaust. Brilliance, creativity, reactivity, agitation, and often a sense of profound urgency and unsafety in the world characterized many of the people with whom I met. Before becoming a rabbi, I had trained in counseling. Feeling compelled to learn more, I began doctoral studies in psychology. Eventually, my research brought me to Jewish Israel, where I interviewed trauma survivors of racial persecution and their descendants, those who had lost children to terror attacks and military incidents, and those who suffered the kind of trauma that is now being termed moral injury in the context of war and occupation. Although Israeli life overflows with color and the cultural richness born of the intermingling of Jewish populations from around the world, most Jewish Israelis harbor some trauma resulting from past racial or religious discrimination. This history is complicated by current wars and an ongoing existential threat created by Israel's precarious location and relationships with its neighbors. As I saw again and again, the consequences of large-scale ethnic trauma correspond to those of individual post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Symptoms such as emotional numbing, hyperreactivity, shame, isolation, and the inadvertent compulsion to reenact traumatic injuries appear similarly in the aftermath of both individual and collective trauma. Recent advances in neuroscience and psychology also gave me a new understanding of the intergenerational effects of trauma. For example, as I'll discuss in Chapter 2, the field of epigenetics offers growing evidence that traumatic events can create a kind of biological memory that emerges under stress. One landmark study carried out in Jerusalem found that the descendants of parents, grandparents, and even great-grandparents who endured persecution, war, and other extreme stresses were prone to depression, anxiety, and other stress responses remarkably similar to those of their ancestors. For Jews today who still live in the shadow of war, racial persecution, and terror attacks, the traits of resilience, resourcefulness, loyalty to tribe, and fierce determination cultivated over generations of adversity are unmistakable. But the harmful byproducts of Jewish historical trauma must also be acknowledged. Left unexamined, they may jeopardize the ethical vision of a proud culture that has survived for thousands of years. Although my research began with a study of damage, I became increasingly focused on healing. I asked, is it possible to transform the effects of historical trauma, to come through life's heavy blows with more wisdom and a sense of inner freedom? The answer is yes. The individuals whose journeys I recount here did the deep work, each in their own way, of facing their injuries and transforming them. We follow them across the world into the bomb shelters of Sderot, on boats in Shanghai, in the New York subway, and on the battlefront of Hebron. All of these people remind us of our own human capacity to rise up after devastation with profound wisdom and inner freedom. I owe them endless thanks for sharing their lives with me. In so many cases, they were eager for their stories to be heard, with the hope that the telling of their lives might deepen an understanding of Jewish historical trauma and alleviate suffering for others. In some cases, at their request, I have changed names to protect their privacy. However, all words and quotation marks are the words that they spoke. The 7 principles in Part 2 emerge directly from their testimonies. They teach us that we can survive extreme trauma and be changed in radically positive ways. At the broadest level, they are 7 directives for staying morally awake in a world rife with terror. The study of Jewish trauma has awakened me to the vastness of the problem of collective trauma. All over the world, cultures and groups are being dislocated by war, poverty, and climatic changes, and fresh wounds are being incurred daily to refugees, religious groups, indigenous tribes, and entire ethnicities. The more we understand the ways in which trauma works, and the deeper our compassion for the plight of those who suffer, including our ancestors and our own selves, the more we have to offer our world. I have learned that we can recognize, choose, and redefine our own destinies, even in the aftermath of ruinous events. Humans are created with the capacity to heal from wreckage, transform fear into compassion, and turn tragedy into strength. The power to heal lives within each of us. Chapter 1: The Price of Silence. The fate of my mother's family remained unmentioned until I was 40. That year, I received a strange phone call. On the other end of the phone was a raspy male voice speaking in a thick hybrid accent. Thinking it a prank, I prepared to hang up, but the voice on the other end protested loudly. "Don't hang up! I am your cousin from Australia, and I am very sad you don't know nothing about your family. You don't even know you have a cousin like me, do you?" "What? Who is this?" "I am Ziggy, your mother's cousin." Over the next half hour, through Ziggy's German-turned-Aussie accent, I gathered his story. He and his family had been rounded up in 1942 from Topolchany, a tiny town in...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?